Well, I'd like to welcome you all to our fifth evening on the Institute on National Affairs. Our topic this year is America's economic system, is it obsolete? Before I introduce tonight's speaker, let me tell you about tomorrow's upcoming events. Tomorrow at noon in the gallery there will be a film on controlling interest. And tomorrow night's speaker will be Paul M. Sweezy, and he's a renowned Marxist, and he will speak on the global crisis of capitalism. And now let me introduce tonight's speaker. Roy Ball is professor of economics and the director of the Metropolitan Studies program at Syracuse University. Previously has held positions as economist in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund and as an assistant professor of economics at West Virginia University. He has served widely as a fiscal consultant to various public and private agencies, both at home and abroad. He is a member of the editorial board of the National Tax Journal, on the directors of the National Tax Association, and an elected member of the Committee on Taxation, Resources, and Economic Development. He has authored several books, monographs, and scholarly papers in the general area of urban and regional economics and finance. Mr. Ball is a native of Miami, Florida, and received his BA from Greenville College in Greenville, Illinois, and his PhD in economics from the University of Kentucky. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Roy Ball.
I guess I'd rather be the fifth consecutive night than the sixth consecutive night. My topic, or the topic originally assigned to Professor Gans, who, as you know, had to cancel a couple of weeks ago, has to do with whether or not it's in the cards that big cities in this country will be revitalized, and I guess many smaller cities will be revitalized. What I would like to do is spend my time talking with you about what I think is happening in this country with respect to revitalization of cities. I think it important to start by offering a perspective. We are, in my view, in a period of adjustment in this country, not unlike periods of adjustment that we've gone through before. There are things happening to the economy, a slower rate of growth, and most of all, there are regional shifts in population and economic activity going on away from the Northeast and away from the Midwest and toward the Southeast and Southwest. And these kinds of changes that have been happening really over the last decade have had a tremendous effect on the health of cities and have had a tremendous effect particularly on the health of cities in the Northeast, which are declining. Now, the perspective really is that these kinds of changes don't go on forever. So we're in a period of adjustment. And because we're in a period of adjustment, we're in a period of very, very serious problem. And we have to consider the issue of whether or not cities are going to be revitalized in terms of this relatively short period. Maybe we're talking about a decade, maybe we're talking about 2 decades. There are problems in both the declining regions and in the growing regions. My view would be that the problems in the growing regions are not so great in the sense that they're not likely to raise questions of major national concern in the next 5 to 10 years. The kinds of things that are going to cause national policy to change are the problems of the cities that are declining in the Northeast and in the industrial Midwest. The biggest problem we have in trying to deal with the issue is that there's a philosophy in this country that bigger is always better and smaller is never as good. And what's happening are that cities are becoming smaller and they're also becoming poorer. Policymakers don't know how to deal with it. Politicians don't want to face it. And academics have nothing to say about it. We can't even teach about budgeting for decline because we don't know what to say. No one has written much or studied much. Now, one more thing. That means that most of my remarks really are going to be about the cities that are in big trouble, and then we'll try to infer from that to other kinds of cities. But one more issue I'll raise, and then I'll forget it, is the issue of the so-called growing cities in the Sun Belt, which are supposed to be healthy. And indeed, they are healthy in the sense that they're growing and per capita income is rising, and in many cases, those cities are wealthier than the northern cities. But poverty can be measured a lot of different ways. And the difference between poverty in the southern cities and in the growing cities and poverty in the north, it has to do with unemployment. In the northern cities, the unemployment rate could be 50% or more among minority groups that are below the U.S. poverty line. In the southern cities, there may be the same percentage of people below the poverty line. That is, you may have the same fraction of people who are poor, but they'll be employed. The unemployment rate may be only half as great in the southern as in the northern cities. Now, what that means is that there are very poor people who are working in the southern cities, which means that there's probably some degree of exploitation of this working group, probably minority group, by businesses in the South. So all is not so well in the southern cities, but they aren't likely to raise the same kinds of national problems. Now, I'd like to just talk about 5 things that I think fit together and I think provide some way for us to raise this question of revitalization. The first one is history. I'm not an historian, but I think that there's much to be learned from what's happened to cities in this country in the past decade. I think in the past 5 years there's much to be learned because history's already begun to repeat itself. There are some major milestones that we reached in the middle of the 70s even, and I'm talking particularly about the New York City financial crisis, that aren't likely to go away and that we're likely to see again in other cities in the near future, and are likely to be major national problems that call forth major national policies. The second thing is I want to deal with 2 issues that have become probably the most important factors affecting the health of cities. One of them is the state of the national economy, particularly inflation and recession. The other is this set of factors that has led to a regional shift, which has been popularized in the press as a shift to the Sun Belt states. Then I'd like to turn to what has been the federal policy response. We've had at least 3 national urban policies that I can think of in the last 10 or 12 years. And I'd like to ask the question about how consistent they've been and what's been the posture of those policies toward revitalization of American cities. And finally, to give you my view of the outlook for cities and the prospects for revitalization. And there I'd like to talk some about this notion of gentrification, which the press has picked up so readily. Now, one has to begin by asking a question, what is the city, or defining what is the city, and you can say it a lot of different ways. We could say the city is a jurisdictional unit, which means city boundaries. If we do that, that means we probably are worried solely about fiscal problems, because jurisdictional units, those are governments that tax and spend, but our concern really runs past jurisdictional problems. But it's important to note that if you look at the political boundaries of the city, that you really have a bad comparison. In the Northeast, there are cities surrounded by suburbs, all of which are jurisdictionally independent. So New York City is in a metropolitan area with 1,400 other local governments, all of whom have property taxing power. If you looked instead at a Jacksonville or a Nashville or a Houston, it's a city, county, or a city metropolitan area where generally there's one government that dominates the area. So they're not really good comparisons across regions. The second thing we could worry about is just the core of the city. I suspect that a lot of the time when we talk about revitalization, we're talking about the central business district. And are we really worried just about the center of big cities, not the jurisdictional unit at all? Well, if that's the case, it means that our concern must be that somehow there are people in the center of cities who are immobile for one reason or another, and are unemployed because of that. And we're worried about core area unemployment, or we may be worried about no more than simply the aesthetics of not wanting cities that look dilapidated and run down in the center, in which case our revitalization question would be, is it efficient somehow to rebuild the city, or really ought we to have a sprawling set of suburbs? If we looked at the problem as it exists in the Northeast, I guess where we would come down is that the issue is that cities are fiscally troubled and that the unemployment rate is very high. And it's very high, especially among minorities. And the fiscal problem means that public services are poor. And if you put those together, it leads us really back to the question of city fiscal problems. City unemployment problems have to do with the distribution of income, and remedial policy ought to address the distribution of income. Okay, history. There are three periods that we could talk about in trying to determine what happened to cities. How did we get to the point where we have to ask the question about revitalization? The first time begins in the 50s and in the 1960s. And it probably starts with a rapid amount of migration that begins right after the Second World War. What happened was that there were shortages of labor in the large industrial centers in the Northeast and in the industrial Midwest. That meant there were lots of jobs for immigrants, usually from the South, rural and or black, and generally unskilled. And as you know, the story is well known. They moved to the city in great numbers because there were opportunities for unskilled people. When they got to the city, about the time they were coming to the cities in great numbers, the federal government decided that it would subsidize a movement of middle-class whites to the suburbs. And it did this a number of ways. It did this in part through mortgage insurance, which made it possible for people to buy that home in the suburbs on a relatively small plot of land, which was thought to be the taste of the white middle-class American at that time. And the way he moved out of the city, it apparently was the taste of the white middle-class American at that time. There were subsidies in transportation. Interstate highway system eventually was built. It made it easier to commute in, to use the automobile, to come downtown to work. So it was possible to move to the suburbs. Oh, there were so many things. There was the federal income tax, which said that if you were a homeowner, that you could deduct your mortgage interest and property tax payments. But if you were a renter living in the city, you could not. And that's another kind of a subsidy for people to move to suburbs. Well, for whatever reasons, there was an enormous migration to the suburbs that took place all through the 50s and all through the 60s. And where it led to was a set of suburban city disparities in almost any indicator of well-being. The vast disparities in per capita income grew up. Gradually, a greater share of people lived in the suburb than lived in the city. There were fiscal disparities, and the way they generally ran is the central city had a higher tax burden. People paid more taxes relative to their income, but they had a lower quality of public services. So the fiscal disparities grew, and there were practices such as fiscal zoning, where people who were in the city were effectively zoned out of the suburbs through different kinds of measures, acreage requirements being one. And this pattern held in the north-central region, all through the industrial Midwest, all through the Northeast. It did not hold in the Southeast. It did not hold in the far West. And that was partly because most cities in those regions didn't have the same kind of city-suburb dichotomy that they have in the older parts of the United States. Then the late 60s and early 1970s, we begin to move into a new phase. The new phase is not only are the central cities declining, but the whole metropolitan area begins to decline. Up to the 1960 census, you could read in any urban economics or urban geography textbook that there was only one metropolitan area of the 200 at that time that had declined, and it was Pittsburgh, and everything else grew. By the late 1960s, early 1970s, we could point to a great number of metropolitan areas that were actually in decline. Between 1970 and 1977, as a matter of fact, 43 metropolitan areas were in decline. So people actually were moving not just out of the central city, but by the late 1960s, they were moving completely out of the boundaries of the metropolitan area. Now, part of this actually is a movement to rural areas. Part of it is clearly to adjacent counties, counties that are adjacent to metropolitan areas, and they still commute into work. But a substantial amount of it is actual movement to rural counties. Okay, that's a very, very important kind of change that occurs, the absolute decline in urban population. Late 60s, early 70s, we see the first signs of this movement to the Sun Belt. Now, it's been going on for a long, long time, but I say we see the first signs of it because it begins to accelerate in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. If you look at the data on migration patterns, And on job movements, you see enormous changes taking place over a 5 or 6 year period beginning around 1967 or 1968. The other kind of movement that went on was the mass movement now, not just of people from the cities to the suburbs, but jobs. It's in the late 1960s that we see the first large amount of movement, actually of manufacturing jobs, out of the city and into the suburbs. Now, the reasons were pretty clear. Manufacturing found it much more efficient to operate not in a loft setting or in a high building setting, but it was more efficient to operate in a campus setting. And so it was only a matter of time till they moved into the suburbs and they took advantage of the possibility of getting away from congestion and finding enough land to build that more efficient campus-type setting. And there was another part of the labor force there. There were working wives in most of those suburbs that was also an attraction. So industry begins moving out of the cities. Now you can find these kinds of information and these kinds of patterns for most big cities in the Northeast and Midwest. But to give you an example, in New York City, which I'll continue to come back and argue is not really an atypical city at all. Things just happen there before they happen other places. In New York, between 1965 and 1974, they lost manufacturing firms with more than 20 employees, firms at a rate of 1 per day. Between 1969 and 1974, they lost about 400,000 jobs. There's only one other city in the country that has 400,000 jobs. There was an enormous out-migration of jobs from the city. This is late 60s, early 1970s. Then the mid to late 70s, the period we're in now. And this period, after all, is important because if your interest is in revitalization and this new movement toward back to the city movement, and whether or not it's a movement that holds any water and is long term, you have to think about the last 2 or 3 years because that's the period when this revitalization is supposed to be happening. Well, what would we see if we looked at the latest numbers and the latest data to see if this kind of a thesis held water? Well, we would see a continuing decline of the Northeast. Actually, there had been a convergence of income. Income in the Northeast and the Midwest always had been greater than the South and the West. It had been coming down in the wealthier regions. It had been going up in the poorer regions. And there was some thinking that it would converge in about the 1970s. What happened is they passed. And between 1975 and this year, during the recovery, if anything, the migration out of the Northeast has accelerated, and the rate of income growth, the differential between the North and the South, has accelerated. So with the recovery, we're not seeing a convergence, but we're seeing probably an acceleration of this movement out of the Northeast and toward what I'll continue to call the Sun Belt. The second thing about the mid to late 70s that's very important is the fiscal problem. There was New York City in 1974. Now, contrary to what you heard the Secretary of the Treasury say and what the President of the United States went on television and said, I think most people who gave a serious look at any of the information and have studied the problem concluded that the problem in New York City was not primarily a financial management problem at all. The problem was that the economic base in the city had completely fallen apart. The city was doing no more than it had always done. It simply could not afford to do what it had always done. And the question is, why was that true? No amount of internal reorganization of the city and no amount of management control is going to correct the basic problem, which was an economic base that won't carry that larger public sector. So it ought not to be a surprise to anyone that 3 years after the emergency measures that were taken, that New York City is fundamentally not that much better off than it was at the height of the crisis. So the second problem was the New York City fiscal crisis. Now we read about Cleveland. Well, you know, we were told New York City was not a typical case. New York City is atypical. Then Cleveland comes along, but their mayor's young, you see, so Cleveland is atypical. Well, I'll tell you, Newark is probably 6 months away. And there are only so many times that you can say these places are atypical before you start asking the fundamental question, what really happened? And what's common in all these places is that the economic base has come apart, and it's come apart for the reasons we were just talking about. Third important thing that happens in the mid to late 70s that sets the stage for whether or not cities can be revitalized is that the national economy starts to grow more slowly. Mind you, we've come through a serious recession, and we're in the midst of a recovery, but I think most people, and I would be surprised if your other speakers haven't said the same thing, most people probably think that the national economy is going to grow more slowly now for a relatively long period of time. What that means is that the amount of the pie that's going to be available is going to be smaller and smaller. And yet, the very cities we're talking about, the ones that are in the most trouble, are already getting a smaller share of what is available. So with a shrinking national economy, it really doesn't bode well for the economy of these cities in the declining regions. Finally, final part of the lesson from history, I think, is the migration question. They came to the big cities looking for jobs. They were unskilled, and they were migrants, and they came from the south. And in the case of some border cities, they came from outside the continental United States. Now, migration in the 1960s out of the Northeast was primarily, not exclusively, but primarily migration of elderly people. And a lot of the migration to the Sun Belt in the early time was migration to Florida. Well, that's been changing. And what's happening in the 70s is that the migration, particularly out of the mid-Atlantic states, which have been leading this decline, that migration has been productive age group people, 25 to 50 years old. In the last 4 to 5 years, the migration has included blacks. That's the first time that's happened. Blacks are actually moving out of the Northeast and the Midwest. Now, who are they? Well, we don't know much about the skill characteristics and the educational characteristics of migrants. There are some survey data available, but the indications seem to be, and you've got to reach a little bit to draw this conclusion, but that the blacks that are migrating out of the central cities in the Northeast tend to be those that are skilled, blue-collar manufacturing workers, craftsmen, operatives. Probably for many of these cities, which have become predominantly black cities, probably the real hope for revitalization of these cities. Now, if that's true, that kind of migration pattern that's taking place in the last couple of years is probably not a happy sign. The last thing we'd say about this is we tried to chart change in dependent population in different parts of the country. And if I can just overdraw a bit, oversimplify to tell you what we found, we took the population that was elderly, we tried over 65. Now that's not a good measure of dependent, but that's the only way we get the numbers. Over 65, under 18, on public assistance or institutionalized. And we took that as a share of the rest of the population. And it's interesting, because what you find is in that region of the country, that percentage has been increasing pretty substantially for about 10 or 12 years, whereas in the growing regions of the country, it's been going down. And what that might indicate is that in the very region where the problems are most severe and the capacity to do something about those problems is most limited, the problems seem to be growing the most. Now that's the stage. What about the two factors that weigh heavily on this problem? Well, one of them is inflation and recession. Let me talk about inflation and recession in the context of this problem, but let me do it probably differently than your other speakers have, because their interest has been more the national economy, and mine really is the urban economy, and that's intimately related to this question of state and local government finance, because finances is what it really gets down to when we talk about revitalization of cities. Think about the budget of a big city. It's labor intensive. If you looked at the budget and you said, what proportion of the operating budget of a city was due to labor costs one way or the other, wages, pensions, uniforms, you would find that percentage to be very, very high, in many cases likely up around 80%. So basically they're labor intensive. Now what happens when the rate of inflation goes up? Well, when the rate of inflation goes up and the cost of living goes up, I guess everyone would agree that public workers, as much as private workers, have a right to an increase in their wage that matches the cost of living. If rate of inflation is around 9 or 10%, that is a pretty substantial bite out of a city budget. If the unions in those cities are very powerful politically, then it's likely that that kind of an increment is going to come forth from the city, even though the city might not be able to afford it. There are other things too. There are energy costs, and you've got to buy gasoline for the police cars, and there's asphalt to repave the streets, and all sorts of other things that are affected by inflation. But it's primarily this labor cost that's very important. Now, on the tax side, cities rely on the property tax. Now, property tax is an interesting thing. It's the primary source of revenue for most city governments. It doesn't respond to inflation. When the cost of living rises in a community, the assessor doesn't go out and reassess property to take account of increasing housing values. Any of you who think about your property tax bill, and I don't know anything about this state, but I'll bet your property tax bill hasn't been growing anything like the price of land in this state. If it is, it's atypical. So what happens is during a period of inflation, labor costs, the cost of providing services go up rapidly, but the tax base, the wherewithal to finance those services, doesn't respond to inflation. We made some estimates on a nationwide basis, and we found that if you took state and local governments together, that over the 72-74 period, when the inflation rate was running 10-11%, that inflation by itself, abstracting from everything else, caused about a 25% increase in expenditures, but generated about a 15% increase in revenues. So there was a 10% loss in the purchasing power of governments just because of inflation. That meant they could buy 10% less with what amount of money they had available. Now, what makes that worse is that if you're one of these cities in the declining regions, you have less money available. And the only way that you can stay alive is either raise taxes or cut services or do both. And they did both in most of these cities. And when they raised taxes, they became even less attractive than they were the day before. One footnote on the inflation thing that I think is kind of interesting, and that's in California in Proposition 13. There was the one case where the property tax was made to respond to inflation. They set the assessment up so that if the price of property went up, if the sale price of your house went up by 20%, then your assessment went up by 20% and your property tax went up. And you saw what happened in California. The moral of the story is that when the property tax is made to work effectively, it's not a good tax. You may own a home that was worth $30,000. The value of the home may rise to $130,000, but you still live in it and you still make the same amount of money you made yesterday. You really can't afford to have your property tax go up $2,000 a year. You'd have to sell your home to pay it. So we get the kind of revolt that we got in California. Well, inflation has been killing these cities in terms of their capacity to finance. They didn't cause inflation, you know. Inflation really comes about in part because of national policies. It's no wonder then that mayors point to the federal government from these cities and they say, you know, to the administration, you really owe us this because after all, you're the ones that are doing it to us. Now the other is recession. We've managed to have both in recent years. We've done some work, and so have some others, trying to determine the extent to which recession affects the declining cities differentially. Do they get hurt worse? Well, the answer is they do. The cities that we're talking about are areas that specialize in manufacturing. It's really called the manufacturing belt in that region of the country. And most of that manufacturing activity is in durable manufacturing. And you know what happens in a recession. If there's any postponement of consumption, you postpone things like refrigerators and automobiles and electric ranges and things like that, durable goods, and you're less likely to postpone the purchase of clothes and shoes and non-durable goods. So you would expect a region that specialized in durable manufacturing to be hit harder. But it's not just that. That's not really what killed these cities. What really killed these cities is the choices that many firms had to make about where they would cut back. It's more like Chrysler will have plants in Detroit and Flint and Syracuse and Illinois and Louisville and other places, and they've got to decide where they're going to cut back. Now, how do they decide, first of all, where they're going to cut back production, where they're going to lay people off? Well, they're going to take the place where production costs are the highest. And that's primarily labor cost, and that's primarily, again, in this same region. So the cutbacks were disproportionately heavier in the Northeast and in the industrial Midwest. And when they had to choose a plant to close, with Bethlehem Steel, because they needed to eliminate one of their plants, they had to choose one. They chose the one in Buffalo. 15,000 jobs were lost on the basis of a decision. It was a good decision. It's the oldest plant that Bethlehem Steel had. It was 30% less efficient than their next least efficient plant. It was the right one to close. Well, in fact, if you think about where the oldest part of the manufacturing establishment is in this country, it's again in this same region. What does that tell you about the possibility for another recession? Well, what it would tell you is that this region would be hit hardest. In fact, this region goes in first. The last two recessions, it's gone in first, it's gone in deeper, and it's come out slower, and it's come out less. This past recession, New York led it in. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. New York led it in by year. The recovery begins about the end of 1975 in the nation. It begins in early 1977 in New York State. It begins about 2 months ago in New York City. So the recession lasts a long time in this region. And we don't know a whole lot about what happened to firms, but what we've been able to gather from data like Dun & Bradstreet, which does a firm survey, suggests something very interesting, that the loss of employment during the recession due to the death of firms, the percentage loss in employment due to firms closing up was about the same in all regions, even in the Sun Belt. The difference in terms of employment loss came about because the birth of new firms was much greater outside the Northeast and Midwest. It was also much greater in suburbs than in cities. And what that means is that new firms open where the action is, and the action just isn't in cities, and one would not really expect them to open in cities, given their own choice. Now that's an important message that says if they have the option to choose, what they'll choose to do is not to reopen in the city. Well, the Sun Belt shifts are going on at the same time. It's accelerated by the recession. The whole movement was abetted by the recession, but really it's something different. The movement's been going on a long time, but it increased very rapidly in the past 7 or 8 years. To give you an idea of what it means, think about, and I hate to keep coming back to New York, but that's what I know best, and that's the best example of a declining state. Think about this for New York State. New York State in 1963, now that, after all, is not so long ago, right? That's 15 years ago. In 1963, New York had a per capita income 27% above the national average. Fantastic decline to undergo in 15 years. It's not, now that leads the way, but it's not that much different if you run down the list of these older industrialized states. And if you think it's bad for the states, you ought to see what it looks like for the big cities in those states, because they led the way in the state. The only growth you're getting in the state are either in the suburbs or in the rural areas. Virtually all of the central cities are in decline. There has been this overconvergence that we talk about then, and per capita income is probably higher in the Sun Belt than in the Northeast. Now, why the shifts? Why did they occur? There's a lot of debate about that, and it depends on which end of the problem you're looking at. Sociologists tell us that tastes have had a lot to do with it, and that tastes, you know, after all, that was the thing that dictated the movement to the suburbs in the first place. Did you ever read the Levitt-Towners? A man wanted a small plot of land and 2 bedrooms for his wife and his 9-year-old boy and his 8-year-old girl. Tastes supposedly have changed. Sociologists say people are looking for more leisure time. They're looking for more outdoor activity. They're looking for a lot less congestion. They aren't really happy about crime, and they really don't like to commute. Firms, apparently sensing this, are attracting middle management by offering positions outside the northeastern corridor. Taste, that may be one part of it. A second reason may be relative cost of doing business, because we all know that firms maximize profits in the long run. And so we could run down the list of relative costs of doing business, and we would find that labor costs are considerably higher in the North than in the South. We would find that energy costs in parts of the North are very, very high relative to the South, especially many parts of the Northeast, which are petroleum-based. We would find that the general cost of living has risen very fast and is higher in the North than in the South, and taxes tend to be much higher in the North than the South. So the cost of doing business is much higher there. There's a more obsolescent plant. Another reason for the movement out, that the physical plant, manufacturing particularly, is simply old, and the market is shifting. In the center of population, you track it from census to census. It's in the Mississippi River now, is that about right? So the market is moving this way. There's another reason not to be in the older part of the country. Why don't we get an equilibrium out of all this? Why do we not get movement out? I mean, our economics would tell us, and we know that's not been good for a whole lot in the last few years, but our economics would tell us that as people begin to move out of the region and they move to the South, that unions would also begin to move to the South, that the cost of living would begin to rise as you had those population pressures, and all these things would start to level out and you get a lot less migration. Well, in fact, that probably will happen sooner or later, but the rate at which these things have been converging has been very, very slow, and it's been reversed by recovery. So we're probably a long time before we find that equilibrium. The only heartening news, if you were a northerner reading the newspapers, would be demonstration that the cost of living is rising faster in the Southeast and Southwest than in the Northeast. There's one more thing that's wrong, and that's in the public sector. In the public sector, people don't accept decline. Once you've had good public services, it's very hard to back away from that and say that I'm now ready for inadequate public services. Imagine when you run into the case, which you may well, or if you haven't already, where the changing age distribution means that you can't afford to keep all 5 elementary schools in the district open, and so you have to reduce it to 4. A tremendous amount of political fighting that goes on. People simply don't want to accept decline. Well, in New York, they found a great solution for it. In 1963, they had this per capita income 27% above the national average. The state and all the local governments in the state spent about 27% more than the national average. There's nothing magic about those two numbers, but it says they were about in balance there. They weren't overspending or underspending relative to their income. Okay, by 1978, they were down to 3% above the national average in per capita income, but per capita spending had gone up to nearly 50% above the national average. So if your income is 3% greater than the nation on average, and if your spending is 50% greater, there's only one way that you can sustain it, and that's with an enormous level of taxation, and that's exactly what there is in New York, the highest level of taxation in the United States. And that's really not the way you attract industry back to a declining region or hold it there. So for the first time that I know of in this country, in the last 3 years, really, New York has begun to decline the size of its public sector. Well, generally, there was this kind of an expansion that went on all over the Northeast. Public sector expanded without much attention to what was happening in the private sector or to their ability to pay for services. One more part of that that I also thought was interesting, and that was that cities in this expansion period found that they could not afford to meet all the costs of government, and they could not give in to the wage demands of the unions, even if the wage demands were fair. And so what they did instead is they did some trading, and instead of giving a $1 increase in the wage today, they were giving it in terms of pension benefits that you can collect 20 years from now. And politicians find that easy to do, right? Because 20 years from now, it's going to be somebody else's problem and not theirs. Well, 20 years from now in many of those cities is now. And the kinds of pension costs that the cities are facing turn out to be enormous. Okay, federal policy. What has federal policy had to say about these cities? Because surely everyone has read these numbers, and the story that I'm telling is, if you take away the shades I think this and I think that. The basic numbers are right, and everyone has read the numbers, and everyone knows what's happening. So what has the federal government done? What does it think about revitalization? Well, I find three distinct national urban policies. First one is the Johnson, what I would call the Johnson's National Urban Policy. Now, Johnson's really had to do with OEO, it had to do with economic opportunity for underprivileged people, and to the extent it had to do with cities, the big push really came through HUD, and the concern was, let's rebuild the middle of cities. You can't really give all this to Johnson because it belongs to some other people as well, but let's rebuild the middle of cities, model cities programs. Let's enormous housing projects in the center of cities. And of course, my view was that that really was a failure. I think a lot of people would agree that that didn't work at all because they forgot about the people. They did a fair job on some of the buildings, but they forgot about the people. And what happened is that that kind of an urban policy didn't work. Well, then came the one in 1970, which is my all-time favorite urban policy. That's the Nixon urban policy, where he stood up and he said, the number one problem facing us in this country is in the cities. And he said, look, they're congested, there are slums, there are ghettos, there are underprivileged people. We must have a policy to deal with this problem in cities. And the issue he raised was there probably were too many people there, and we had to thin them out so we could do something about the environment and about the quality of life. And so we got new towns, right? We got new towns. We were going to build new towns everywhere to get the people out. Well, he was going to push ahead with that, but about a year later, you know, there was a new number one priority that he had to deal with, and he forgot all about national urban growth policy. So then comes Carter with his urban policy, which is my second all-time favorite urban policy, because he looked at it and he said, these big cities, now mind you, 8 years before, the problem was they were too big, too congestion, we had to build new towns to get people out there. 8 years later, he says, these cities are losing population. That's unthinkable. What we need is a national urban policy to get people back to the city. So now we get rid of new towns and we get the Carter National Urban Policy, which has to do with revitalization of the center of cities. The absolute inconsistency, if you can find a thread of rationality in the thing over that period of time, you're doing a whole lot better than I. If any of you were with me and about 1,000 other people at the President's Conference on National Urban Policy, you heard at least two very high-ranking administrative officials get up and say it all about national urban policy. They said, we, the administration, have a national urban policy for everyone. It's not just for declining cities, but also for growing cities. It's not just for cities, it's also for suburbs. And it's not just for urban areas, it's also for rural areas. And everyone, therefore, ought to be very happy about it. And that's exactly what they've set out to do, provide a special benefit to everyone. In fact, there was a national urban policy that wasn't called national urban policy, and it's very important to this whole revitalization argument, and it takes place between 1974 and 1978. My friend at Brookings, Dick Nathan, says it nicely, I think. He says the administration had a very good national urban policy until they sat down and tried to work one out. What they did was the cities were declining, they were in terrible financial shape, we were just in the midst of the New York thing, and we were headed for a pretty severe recession, and most everyone had smelled that out, and then there was the energy thing. So there was need to do something to stimulate the economy, and the city problems were pretty bad. So what do you do? Well, what you do is you increase government spending at a very rapid rate, and you channel that grant money, you target it, if you will, into these cities that are most distressed. And that's exactly what they did. And they did it with 3 programs. They did it with CETA, with a program called Countercyclical Revenue Sharing that started about 2 years later, and with a program called Local Public Works. And those 3 programs together, they were a milestone because they bypassed the states, they channeled the money directly to the cities, and the great share of the money went to the hardest pressed cities. I'll tell you how important just those programs were. According to the ACIR in Washington, and talking about now 20 big depressed cities, the ratio of direct federal monies to total revenues raised from own sources was about 6%. 15 years ago. It was about 12 to 15% around 1970. And the estimated amount for 1978, including these programs in many of these cities, was about 60%. So they had come to depend almost, completely on these three programs to stay alive. Now that becomes very important. That was a national urban policy. In 1978, what is national urban policy? Well, SETA has been cut back, countercyclical is now gone, and local public works is now gone. So here is a major share of what local governments big cities were relying on that's gone. That can't augur well for their financial position in the next couple of years. We need welfare reform badly as part of national urban policy, especially on the financing side. I don't see that we're any closer to that than we have been. There's the New York City problem. Have we solved the New York City problem? The answer, of course, is no. We've bought a little time on it, but we haven't begun to solve it. That's not so bad, I think, because there are reasons why you simply can't let New York City go down, partly because of its influence on this bond market. But over and above that, New York City is just first. I'm as convinced, I'm as sure as I'm standing here, that it's going to happen again in other places in the very near future. And then what are we going to do? We can't have a special program for every city. Someone really has to think about what national policy will be. And then there is the budget this time, which cut back urban aid programs substantially. It's going to hurt the same set of cities. What we've been given by way of national urban policy is not a whole lot. What we've been given is something called a development bank for cities. The government may spend something like $2 billion nationwide on it and spread it around the country. And it's to subsidize business to go back and redevelop in cities. I think one would have to worry a great deal about such a small program as being an important part of a national urban policy. Now, the outlook. All of the factors that we've talked about so far are the factors that have led to this decline of the big cities. And that's the setting for whether or not there can be revitalization. And we've got to ask the question, what are the chances that these same factors are somehow going to reverse themselves? Why should we get a change now? Why should something different now in 1978 and 79 and 1980 that'll reverse the situation for cities? Well, let's take the things we talked about. Take the Sun Belt shifts. Are there indications that there are factors at work that are going to slow down this movement to the Sun Belt? Well, the gap, in fact, has widened during the 75-77 recovery. That's not good news. Migration has accelerated between 1975 and 1977. That's not good news. If people are trying to avoid cold weather, that's not going to change. What that really does is it leads you down to the other part of the scorecard that says that factor costs have to eventually begin to rise quickly in the South. We know that as manufacturing spreads out of the Northeast, the union has to follow. And sooner or later, the union will get strong in the private sector. And when that happens, it'll spread to the public sector, and the public sector will unionize, and the cost of providing public services in the South and in the Southwest will begin to go up. And sooner or later, we'll move toward an equilibrium. But if you're looking for the signs of that in 1977 or 1978, you'll be looking for a long time because they aren't there. A second hope for the cities is that there's some kind of a revitalization of city economies that's going on. And there's a lot of press about this. The journalists are really taken with the idea of the revival of the city. And what you got to do is sort out the romantic notions about wanting the city to be revived from the hard facts about whether or not that's happening, and if it is, the extent to which it's happening and how it's happening. Now, cities are changing their economic structure. They're becoming much more service-oriented. Manufacturing is moving out. From a point of view of cities and their viability in the long run, that's probably good. Cities really aren't made for today's manufacturing need. Cities declining in terms of their congestion is probably not bad. Cities losing population is probably not bad. It'll give us a lot of breathing room in the areas of housing and probably in environmental control. So none of that's bad. there is the question of rebirth of the central business district. Is it happening, and where is it happening? Well, some places it does, and some places it doesn't. I don't think that there's anyone that's laid out any kind of a magic and said this is why it works in San Antonio and why it doesn't work in Des Moines and why it does work in St. Petersburg. But the big issue is a thing called gentrification, and that's where all the controversy swirls. You know, gentrification is a term that was borrowed from the British, and it's a term that's used in England. Well, you planners all know that. And I guess it came from referring to the gentry, who were middle, upper income people who moved back to the city. They moved back to the city, but they didn't move back to cities like that looked like the South Bronx either. They moved back where there was basically good housing, and they rebuilt neighborhoods, and they brought neighborhoods back. And this process of gentrification, kind of a rebirth of the city, did go on in a lot of European cities. Partly it was because the cost of housing had got so blamed high and the commute so long, and because the disposable income and the wherewithal to make that kind of a commute weren't the same in the European cities as in the United States. But gentrification went on. Is it happening in the U.S.? Well, a lot of the romantics think that it is. I clipped something from Peter Hall, who's a very smart guy, a British guy, in his book, The World Cities. Let me read you a paragraph, and I'll tell you, this is what I mean by the romantic notion of gentrification. This is what you'd like to happen. At the very center of each world city, there is found a small nucleus of highly skilled professionals who live in one way or another by creating, processing, or exchanging ideas. The stockbroker, considering the fortunes of 100 companies in a dozen countries. The company lawyer pondering a difficult piece of patent law. The consultant considering whether to recommend an operation. The university professor arguing about urban growth in a seminar. The editor looking for a specialist to write on the latest trouble spot in Asia. The television producer discussing a script on the housing problem with a journalist. The advertising copywriter talking about a campaign with an account executive. The freelance photographer taking varied assignments from half a dozen editors. All these people live only on their ideas. The central business district, therefore, can be seen as a specialized machine for producing, processing, and trading specialized intelligence. And the ideas industry is growing many times faster than industry as a whole. Well, that may be, but it don't generate jobs in the center of cities. And if you look at the data on movement back to the cities, you don't find evidence that there is a movement back. Now, you can hardly find a city where there isn't some kind of a renovation of an old neighborhood going on. Capitol Hill in Washington, many of the brownstone areas in New York, all over the Northeast, in Boston, people have moved back in. They've found basically sound housing. They've taken a chance, made a speculative investment, and neighborhoods have been reborn. But for every one of those neighborhoods that's reborn, there are others that continue to decay, and you get the movement out of the city and the decline. And anyway, the people who write about gentrification in the United States are people who write about it in terms of, you know, account executives making decisions for 17 countries, things that maybe happen in New York and maybe happen in Los Angeles, but people that write about ideas and exciting lifestyles, and that young people without children want to live in the cities haven't lived in Syracuse or Akron or Toledo, because maybe they don't look that way in the middle of those kinds of cities. So gentrification, I think, is something that the gentry likes very much to write about, but I don't really see any evidence that this is taking place other than the rebirth of some of those neighborhoods. Now, that's not bad, the rebirth of those neighborhoods. That's not bad, but that's not a salvation for the city. That's not going to get the city out of the hole that it's in. It's also said that the energy crisis may do it. If energy costs get high enough, gasoline costs so much, people won't commute as far to work, and that's a salvation for the city. Well, I agree all the way up to the last line. Gasoline will get high. People will not want to spend that much money to commute that far to work, so they'll drive a shorter distance to work. Of course, you know, most of the jobs now are in the suburbs, not in the city at all. And so what will happen is it'll accelerate the movement of jobs further accelerate the movement out of the city toward the suburbs, which is where the labor force is. So I think the energy crisis probably doesn't hold any solution for the cities. I want to say a couple of words about federal policy in terms of the outlook. We've talked about federal policy toward grants, and I won't cover that again. But what about the business cycle? If recession and inflation are so damning to big cities, then doesn't the federal government have a responsibility to worry about cities when it undertakes some kind of a stabilization policy that eventually gets us to a point where we have substantial fluctuation in the business cycle? Well, we apparently are headed for some kind of a recession at the end of this year, at the beginning of next year. And we already are dealing with a relatively high rate of inflation. Federal policy really shapes, more than anything else, what cities can do. If there is a recovery, then federal grants will be cut back and cities will lose. If there's a recession, job losses will be greatest in the cities. Either way, the declining cities are going to lose. One more point that I think is kind of interesting, the cities in the long run are losing seats in Congress, right? Because there are fewer people living in cities. They're also losing seats in the state houses. That means that their leverage to affect a favorable policy is much more limited. And the fiscal problems are still severe. Remember, there are 3 good reasons why there haven't been any more New Yorks since 1975. The first one is that we got this enormous influx of aid. The second one is that we had a national recovery, which they benefited from some. And the third one is that they deferred. Cities deferred the maintenance on their capital stock to where it's in a fairly horrible state now. And sooner or later, you have to come back on those deferrals and do something about it, and you can't really wait till a crisis time. That may be the biggest problem facing cities, is what to do about their streets and sewer and water supply systems. Now, finally, the need. What can be done? What ought the federal government to do? Well, the first thing, it seems to me, is to deal with the possibility that revitalization isn't the right strategy at all, that we're not going to revitalize cities, that if you're thinking the industrial Midwest and the Northeast are going to be the great manufacturing centers that they were 15 years ago, you're just wrong. Manufacturing is not going to move back in the next few years to do that, and there's no amount of subsidy that'll do it. If you provide enough subsidy, you can get people to do something in the short run. I'm sure that if you paid some guy enough, he would farm bad land until you quit paying him to do it, in which time he would quit. Well, it would be the same way if you could attract industry to go back to a region where the terms of doing business were unfavorable. So revitalization really isn't in it, at least not in that sense. They're not going to bring manufacturing back to the cities. What they really ought to do is begin to think about what's wrong with being smaller. What's wrong with New York City? Instead of 8 million people being 6 million people or even 5 million people. At least it may have a chance then, depending on who those 5 million people are and depending on what other kinds of structural changes are made. What's wrong with switching to a service economy primarily and not being manufacturing based? If you ask a New Yorker, if you ask me, who lives in New York, what's wrong with being poorer? Well, there's plenty wrong with that. You know, you'd rather be 27% above the national average. But New York isn't, and neither is New Jersey, and neither is Pennsylvania. They're approaching the national average. Well, lots of other cities and lots of other states have been below the average for lots of other years, and so it's possible to do it. But there has to be an adjustment, and that's the second thing that must be done. There must be an adjustment at the state and local level and a realization that smaller isn't necessarily worse and that it's possible to shrink the size of the public sector. It may well be possible that the optimal policy for a governor to follow is to stand up and say, our problem is that the schools are just too good, the health services are just too good, and we've got to find the best way possible to make them worse because we just can't afford what we have and we can't afford to keep the level of taxes this high. Cities aren't dead. Some people have described cities as a cancer in society. that they're dying and that they ought to be scrapped and that we ought to go back and start all over again. Well, that's of course absurd. That's not right. It's just that the role of cities is changing. All sorts of technological changes and tastes have changed in this economy, and the role of cities is a different role. It's a service role. It's a less dominant role in terms of the population that lives in cities and in terms of its political power. But there's nothing wrong with that. There's also nothing wrong with an adjustment that spreads the wealth in this country from a region that has dominated it to the rest of the country. Thank you. Yes?